to a podcast for radicals, the series that takes you from theory to collective action, one episode at a time. I'm your host, Jason Bayless. Last time we talked about what radicalism is, its core principles, its ethos, and how it's distinguished from reformist approaches. Today, we're diving into the evolution of radicalism. We'll look at key figures, revolutionary movements, and transformative eras that have built the foundation of what radicalism means in the 21st century. This podcast is part of a guide for radicals, from theory to collective action, a series where we explore and bring to life key concepts through podcasts, panel discussions, workshops, and online courses. We're here to encourage critical exploration and support you in applying these ideas to your work for social change. You can find the link to the full series in the description. The story of radicalism doesn't start with the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when the term began to gain significant traction, or even with the Enlightenment era. Its roots are far deeper, stretching back to early forms of resistance and philosophical critiques of power structures across different cultures. Radicalism, as a tradition, emerged long before it was labeled. Throughout history, marginalized communities and revolutionary thinkers have resisted the status quo, envisioning new forms of social organization. In medieval Europe, groups like the Diggers and Levelers questioned the divine right of kings, promoted common ownership of land, and demanded equitable governance. The Diggers sought to establish agrarian communities with shared land, while the Levelers pushed for expanded suffrage and more equitable governance during the English Civil War. Figures such as Gerard Winstanley, a member of the True Leveler, led efforts to establish agrarian communities based on collective labor, setting an early precedent for later democratic and socialist movements. Let's now examine one of the earliest inspirations from the Western or European strand, ancient Greece. At the same time, in the global South, other forms of radicalism were also emerging, each challenging power in their own unique ways, which we will explore later. In Greece, one key figure stands out, Diogenes the Cynic. Diogenes challenged social norms in complex and nuanced ways, critiquing authority and materialism as part of his broader philosophical stance. He lived during a time when Athens was in decline, following its defeat in the Peloponnesian War, which adds further context to his rejection of conventional values. His philosophy, known as cynicism, embraced simplicity and self-sufficiency, critiquing the excesses of power and material wealth in Athens. Cynicism also laid a foundation for later traditions like Stoicism, which carried forward some of his anti-authoritarian ideals. Diogenes was often seen as an outsider, even mocked as a madman. But his life was a living critique of power, a direct rejection of social hierarchies and conventional values, very much in line with the early roots of what we now think of as radicalism. His emphasis on authenticity and rejection of societal norms also influenced future radical thinkers by demonstrating that true liberation involves questioning every facet of societal power and rejecting artificial constructs of authority. His philosophy, while not an organized movement, laid the groundwork for rejecting systems that perpetuate inequality. This kind of rejection of wealth and status in favor of authenticity and individual virtue resonates with many contemporary radical movements that advocate for autonomy, equality, and the dismantling of oppressive power structures. And it's not just in Greece that we find the roots of radical thinking. Across the globe, we see similar critiques of power developing independently. Another aspect often overlooked in the history of radicalism is indigenous resistance. Long before European colonization, indigenous societies practiced forms of governance that emphasized community, collective decision-making, and respect for the environment. These systems directly challenged the principles of private property and hierarchical authority that colonial powers would later impose. Take, for example, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose governance model included elements of consensus but also had hierarchical aspects. Their approach to community governance provided a contrast to the emerging colonial state systems, although it was more complex than a simple alternative. And their resistance to colonial encroachment wasn't just about survival. It was about asserting the right to maintain these values in the face of systematic attempts at eradication. From the Haudenosaunee to the Mapuche people in Chile, indigenous societies have long been at the forefront of resisting power impositions and asserting their traditional ways of life. These societies developed forms of governance and social organization that emphasize collective well being, mutual aid, and respect for the environment, directly challenging colonial principles of private property and hierarchical authority. This resistance was not isolated. Indigenous groups across Africa, Asia, and the Americas also fought against dispossession and imposed authority, contributing to a broader tradition of anti colonial radicalism that continues to inspire movements for justice today. Their resistance provides a living example of the radical tradition, prefiguring a world rooted in sustainability, mutual aid, and autonomy. Let's fast forward to Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Enlightenment was a time of profound change, where the intellectual underpinnings of modern radicalism began to form. Thomas Paine, for example, played a pivotal role in this shift. His influential pamphlet Common Sense ignited revolutionary fervor in the American colonies by making the case for independence in accessible and persuasive language. Paine's arguments resonated deeply with ordinary people, motivating many to join the revolutionary cause. His later work, The Rights of Man, laid out a more radical vision of democracy, advocating for social welfare, economic equality, and true representation, ideas that went beyond political independence to envision a just and equitable society. Paine's ideas emphasized that true democracy involved more than just political liberty. It required social and economic justice as well. This period wasn't monolithic. It consisted of both radical and conservative strands. Figures like Voltaire and Montesquieu, while advocating for reform, often differed from more radical thinkers like Rousseau, highlighting the diverse approaches to liberty, authority, and governance. Philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Mary Wollstonecraft, John Locke, and Thomas Paine challenged the entrenched hierarchies of their time, envisioning societies built on liberty and equality. Rousseau famously argued against private property as the root of inequality, and his concept of the general will envisioned political legitimacy coming from the collective will of the people rather than monarchs. His famous declaration, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains," captured a critique of social structures that would fuel future revolutions and continue to resonate with modern calls for social equality and democratic governance. Wollstonecraft expanded these ideas to include gender equality, arguing forcefully for women's rights to education and political participation. Her groundbreaking work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, laid the foundation for future feminist movements, challenging the deeply entrenched patriarchal norms of her time. Wollstonecraft's critique demonstrated how Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality could be applied to gender, pushing the boundaries of what these principles meant in practice. Her work laid the foundation for future feminist movements that would continue challenging gender-based oppression. But we should also acknowledge that Enlightenment thought was rife with contradictions. Many of its philosophers championed liberty and equality, yet supported colonial systems of exploitation. John Locke, for instance, argued for natural rights and liberty through his social contract theory, which was revolutionary for his time. However, he also defended property rights that perpetuated colonial and capitalist exploitation, revealing inherent contradictions in his philosophy. While Locke's work on the social contract inspired many radical movements, his selective application of liberty excluded marginalized groups such as women, enslaved peoples, and colonized populations, highlighting limitations that later radicals sought to address. His work on the social contract was influential, but his selective application of liberty highlighted the inherent contradictions of Enlightenment ideals. These contradictions were later challenged by radicals who sought a more inclusive interpretation of Enlightenment values, striving to expand notions of equality and justice to all individuals, regardless of gender, race, or social status. Later radical movements pushed Enlightenment ideas to become truly inclusive, ensuring that the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity applied universally. Moving into the late 18th and early 19th centuries, we see the rise of powerful movements that brought radical ideas to life in tangible, transformative ways. The abolitionist movement was one of the earliest modern examples of systemic resistance, challenging not just the institution of slavery, but the entire socioeconomic systems that upheld it. Figures like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and William Lloyd Garrison didn't just call for the end of slavery, They demanded systemic change that would address the underlying causes of oppression. Douglass, with his speeches and writings, highlighted the moral and political hypocrisies of a nation built on both liberty and enslavement. Truth, a former enslaved person, used her voice to advocate for both abolition and women's rights, intertwining the struggles against racial and gender oppression. One of her most famous speeches, Ain't I a Woman?, delivered at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in 1851, powerfully highlighted the intersection of race and gender, questioning societal norms and demanding equality for all, a pioneering concept at the time. Harriet Tubman, known as the Moses of her people, took direct action by leading numerous enslaved individuals to freedom through the Underground Railroad, risking her life repeatedly and embodying the spirit of radical resistance. The exact number she helped escape is debated among historians, with estimates ranging up to around 70 people. She also served as a spy and scout for the Union Army during the Civil War, directly contributing to the fight against slavery. Another significant figure was William Lloyd Garrison, a prominent abolitionist and journalist. Garrison was one of the early leaders of the abolitionist movement, known for his fiery rhetoric and unwavering stance against slavery. Through his publication, The Liberator, he called for immediate emancipation, rejecting gradual approaches as insufficient. Garrison's outspoken advocacy pushed the abolitionist movement toward more radical demands, influencing public opinion and creating a sense of urgency around the need for justice. And then there was the Haitian Revolution, one of the most significant and successful slave rebellions in history. The revolution was led by key figures such as Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Henri Christophe, who were instrumental in organizing enslaved people to rise up against the French colonial powers. Louverture, a former enslaved person, became a brilliant military leader and statesman, navigating complex alliances and leading the movement for freedom and independence. Imagine the power of that moment, an entire nation of formerly enslaved people rising up against the colonial powers, throwing off the chains of slavery, and establishing the first independent Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. The Haitian Revolution wasn't just about freedom from enslavement, it was about autonomy, equality, and self-determination, in direct defiance of the global systems of colonialism and capitalism. It also inspired other anti-colonial and abolitionist movements worldwide, showing that even the most oppressed could rise up to challenge deeply entrenched power structures. The revolution's success, however, came at a steep price. Haiti faced international isolation, and France demanded enormous reparations to compensate former slaveholders, a financial burden that weighed on the young nation for more than a century, contributing to economic hardships that persist today. Despite these challenges, the Haitian Revolution provided a living testament to the possibility of emancipation and self-governance, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. The ripple effects of the Haitian Revolution were felt across the Americas, fueling fears among slaveholding societies and inspiring both enslaved peoples and abolitionist movements to resist and organize. It demonstrated that true liberty had to include dismantling the structures of exploitation and building something new. With the Industrial Revolution came new forms of exploitation, and in response, radical movements that aimed to dismantle these systems. The rapid industrialization brought significant economic changes, but also terrible working conditions, long hours, unsafe environments, child labor, and the constant threat of unemployment, leading workers to organize and demand change. The First International, also known as the International Workingmen's Association, was founded in 1864 to unite various socialist, communist, and anarchist factions to address worker exploitation and challenge capitalist structures. Figures such as Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin, a Russian anarchist, and James Guillaume, a Swiss anarchist who advocated for education and worker-led initiatives as pathways to social change. While they didn't always agree, they shared a common goal: to challenge the injustices of capitalism and build a society rooted in equality and mutual aid. Marx argued for class struggle and envisioned the dictatorship of the proletariat as a transition to a stateless society, while Bakunin warned of the dangers of centralized power even in revolutionary hands. These tensions highlighted the rich diversity of thought within the movement. Labor actions during this period began to show the power of organized resistance. For example, The London Tailors' Strike of 1866 was one of the first major strikes involving the First International, demonstrating the potential of collective action in challenging capitalist power structures. The strike mobilized a significant portion of the workforce, drawing public attention to the poor working conditions and unfair wages. It also inspired further labor actions across industries, showing that collective resistance could force employers and authorities to take workers' demands seriously. These strikes and labor movements were not just about achieving better wages or safer working conditions. They were about fundamentally dismantling the capitalist system that exploited workers. The members of the First International believed that workers themselves should control the means of production, asserting that economic justice was inseparable from political freedom. The spirit of international solidarity forged by the First International set the foundation for future labor movements across the world. Workers realized that capitalism was not just a local or national issue, it was a transnational system that required a united global response. This solidarity has remained a core feature of radical labor movements ever since. Building on the momentum created by the First International and earlier labor movements, the Paris Commune in 1871 was another powerful example of what worker-led governance could look like. The Paris Commune was directly influenced by the ideas and strategies discussed within the First International, and many of its leaders and participants were active members. It was an experiment in radical democracy, where workers sought to reorganize society along egalitarian lines, prioritizing collective welfare over private profit. The people of Paris took control of their city, establishing a society based on communal governance and shared responsibility. Though it was violently suppressed by the French government, the Commune's influence has endured, serving as a symbol of what could be possible if workers take control. It illustrated the potential of direct worker governance and provided a model that inspired future socialist and communist movements, including the Russian Revolution and countless others who saw in the Commune a practical example of proletarian self-management. It showed that a new world, organized along radically different lines, one emphasizing equality, communal decision-making, and social justice, was not only possible but worth fighting for. As we look back on the evolution of radicalism, from ancient thinkers like Diogenes to indigenous resistance, to Enlightenment-era critiques, to the abolitionist struggle, the Haitian Revolution, and labor movements, it's clear that radicalism is not a static ideology. The connections we draw between these movements are often clearer in hindsight than they were to the participants themselves. Some radical thinkers, like Mikhail Bakunin, were well aware of their predecessors and consciously built upon their ideas, while others, like Diogenes, developed their thoughts in relative isolation, unaware of parallel or previous movements. Each of these movements influenced one another, creating a web of interconnected struggles for justice, conscious continuation, and unconscious parallel development. By understanding this history, we equip ourselves with the tools to continue that struggle today, recognizing the interconnectedness of these movements, from the anti-colonial fervor inspired by the Haitian Revolution to the solidarity formed by early labor activists, helps us see that radical change has always required a convergence of efforts from different groups unified against oppression. Thank you for joining us for episode 2 of a podcast for radicals. If you enjoyed today's journey through radical history, please subscribe, share, and consider joining our community at A Radical Guide. This podcast is part of a Guide for Radical series, and your support helps us continue creating these episodes. If you like what we're doing, consider making a tax-deductible donation to support our work. Next time, we'll continue exploring the key principles of modern radicalism. I look forward to having you join us. Until next time, remember, follow ideas, not people.